What's up, YouTube? So a lot of people have asked about kind of my testing process when I'm thinking about trying out a new card or something. And in this example, trying out Shadow of Mortality in Dimir Shadow and kind of what that looks like. And so I've got this backlog of videos that I put together of previous leagues testing out like the initial testing process of Shadow of Mortality and then like swapping back to some non-shadow, then back to Shadow of Mortality again, just to try to see if it was like really a card I wanted to invest the time in. So, oh man, there's like 7 or 8 leagues that I'll do voiceover at some point, but just if you see these videos kind of popping up periodically, a lot of them are from the last week, 2 weeks, something like that, where it's just been like, hey, is this card something I want to consider? Let me run a league with it, try it. So they weren't really like leagues that I was really planning on uploading. They're just like additional leagues where I thought it would be kind of cool to see, hey, this is the initial steps of the process. This is like the building blocks to determining if this card is what I want. So we'll see a lot of those coming up. Probably upload one every few days or so, maybe in addition to like a current league, but I might label them separately. I might not. I might just throw them under Dimir Shadow. Either way, it's Dimir gameplay, so not too much to say there. If you've been following along with the Dimir content, this is kind of the list I've been fairly settled on recently, with the 2 Shadow of Mortality in the main, 3 or 4 Murktide. I've been like on 3 Murktide and a Brazen Borrower, sometimes 4 Murktide. Earlier on in the testing, I was on 4 Murktide. Kind of came to where I didn't want to see that second Murktide as often. And with Shadow of Mortality, you really don't need to see it. On and off between like Archmage's Charm, second Dress Down. The Hallowed Fountain, I think has been really nice. Think the first few leagues I tried to Steam Vents, realized, oh, Hallowed Fountain actually has implications with like Cleaved Path of Peril. So something to keep up with it or keep up with there. Otherwise, if you are looking for other Dimir Shadow content, I know Corey Baumeister posted a video with Dimir, actually posted a video with Rebellion's top 4 challenge list, which was actually our list from a couple weeks ago. So that was really, really cool to see that Rebellion ran it to a top 4 modern challenge finish. And then Corey went and subsequently did a video on that list. So really cool to see. I also have, I'm starting to get through the test leagues of the new cards. So if you're interested in some of the new stuff from the Lord of the Rings set, Orcish Bowmeister, Orcish Bowmeister, Orcish Bowmaster, the 1 mana counter spell that hits like a creature CMC 2 or less, the legendary artifact that exiles stuff when they die, and then you can like get the Soul Guide Lantern effect out of it. Those are all on the block to test. There's a few more, but I can't remember off the top of my head, so we'll get to them when we get to them. But let's just go ahead and jump into this league so you can see some of this gameplay. For the leagues like the backlogged practice leagues, I'm going to be going through a lot quicker on those. Like I didn't stop and edit them as much because like I said, I wasn't really expecting to or planning to upload them. So they'll be pretty short videos. But before I hop into this one, because I need to get better about saying it at the beginning of the video, if you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, please, please, please consider dropping a subscription here. Doesn't cost you anything, just lets you know whenever new videos get posted. Also have a link to the Discord below, as well as a link to the deck list and a link, or it might not be a link to this specific deck list. It might be a link to like the current Dimir deck list, but you can always see the changes like in the video from the beginning. I try to pause and show what the list looks like. Um, and then link to the Twitch stream below. So if you're wanting to catch like a live stream of Shadow or something Shadow-ish, that's the place to go. So good opening hand. We got like turn one Thoughtseize, Drown to deal with any creature that comes down, counter spells to deal with anything after that. We're up against Enchantress. So we're taking the Sanctum Weaver, and of course that means top deck Sanctum Weaver. You know how it is with Thoughtseize bugs. Ultimately, like as long as I fight over this Enchantress's presence, I don't really care too much about the rest of their hand. Like the ossification's only live when this is let's pause real quick so I can talk about this mindset. Ossification is only live when I want it to be live. What does that mean? It means if I don't play out a creature, that card does nothing in my opponent's hand. So I get to determine when ossification is live. So if I don't want to play out a threat with counter backup, or if I don't have counter backup, I can choose to just not play out a threat. And so that card doesn't matter until I let it matter. It's the same thing that happens with cards like um, deflecting palm out of burn, where it's, hey, that card is dead until I choose to attack and I make it live. So remember when you're in these situations, like, yeah, they have a way to deal with the death shadow, but it doesn't matter until I'm okay with it mattering. Like, we can get to a point later in the game where I have to play out a threat and they can ossification it. But if I choose to play out a threat early, it's because I am okay with letting that ossification be online, or I'm okay with dealing with it if I so choose. So another Sanctum Weaver doesn't matter. Ossification's what I've chosen to fight over here. There's no way they're playing out self or solitary confinement because they would have to just discard the ossification. And then from here, it's pretty smooth sailing, just attacking in. They can play the confinement as they want, as like a 3-mana fog, but that's completely okay with me because they'd have to skip their next draw step. As long as I'm fighting over like these Enchantresses presences so they can't draw a card off solitary confinement. Because that would be a really bad situation, would be to let them resolve the Enchantress's presence, cast a solitary confinement, draw a card to enable the solitary confinement, and me turn my one fog into multiple fogs. Sideboarding against Enchantress. Dress down's pretty medium. You can like shut off one of their creatures that like what is it, Hand of Sithis, I think, the green white one that has the Enchantress's presence effect. You can shut off that, but I'd rather just shut it off with like removal spells and counter spells. Trimming a Murktide and a Drown because they're really likely to bring in like Rest in Peace, and then I trimmed a Thoughtseize because of Leyline of Sanctity. Brought in like some Turoks, brought in Path of Peril to help fight over all of the enchantment creatures if they have a Sterling Grove out. Is it Sterling Grove? No. The one that gives everything Shroud. If they have that out, then I can't fight over it with removal spells. I'd have to fight with Path of Peril. Um, I also sometimes I always bring in EE, sometimes bring in Spreading Seas because it can fight over like this snow covered forest with the Utopia Sprawl. Or if your opponent's playing like red for Chain to the Rocks or something like that, you can hit a mountain, knock off Chain to the Rocks. But usually they just play the one that on thin ice that you exile it onto a snowland, and Spreading Seas does not remove the snow. I think is it super type? Can't remember what it's considered, but it doesn't remove that. So All right, we'll go ahead and pop this EE. They're going to get one Sterling Grove. They can use the second one, but they're just going to shuffle away whatever they get with the first. So that's kind of fine. So here, kick a Turok. They could have Veil of Summer. I wasn't thinking about Surge of Salvation. Did I have the mana to? No, they floated two, so I couldn't Stubborn Denial the Surge of Salvation there. Just double checking. But that's pretty okay with me. Like, I've got this turn kind of shields down a little bit, but after this, I can just drop a big threat, hold up Drown and Stub, and not really care about much else after that. I know Shadow of Mortality is bigger, but Murktide being able to fly is very relevant. Stony Silence. You got it. So just to stop like E, which would be pretty solid right here. But I only run one EE and I've already seen it, so there's not much of a reason to fight over Stony Silence. Oh, that was the better reason for not playing Shadow of Mortality, for playing Murktide, is I didn't have the mana to play Shadow, hold up Stub, and Drown, but I could play Murktide, hold up Stub, and Drown. Stonks. Yeah, we're just gonna continue to hit our opponent in the face with some dudes. That is not how Surge of Salvation works. Surge of Salvation only prevents damage done to creatures. It does not prevent damage that you do to your opponent. So, all right, so this is round number 2. Again, pretty reasonable hand. Just Thoughtseize into counter spells. Take a Ren, see Pending, Ice Fang Coatl. I have an unnatural hatred of the card Ice Fang Coatl, and it's mostly because of how good it is against like the decks I typically enjoy. It dodges Stubborn Denial. It's usually draw a card plus a removal spell, and that's just really, really, really a pain to deal with. So I'm gonna prefer my opponent not have access to that card. All right, I could play out a Shadow here, but I wouldn't be able to hold up Counterspell. So I'm a little bit happier just like fighting over an Omnath here. Going back to my turn, drawing again, maybe finding another fetch land or something. Again, same kind of idea. I'm not playing out the Shadow because I don't have Counterspell backup on it. But now I can play out the Shadow, have Counterspell. Fight over the Binding because there's only like so many ways they can actually deal with Shadow of Mortality. It's like Leyline Binding and Leyline Binding to Fairy Solitude. So I kind of want to uh, try my best to limit how many of those actually hurt me at any given time. All right, so pretty rough that they had the Solitude as well. Get down Murktide before they can Endurance. Yeah, just bring to light for another Solitude. So we'll scoop to that. Um, it's kind of funny because like matches like right there, we don't really lose to Solitude for being the like eggs, or not for being the life gain part of Solitude, which is usually what you think of when it comes to Shadow. Like, oh, you lose to Solitude because you lose or gain all this life and it kills all your shadows. That's usually not the case. Like, you just lose to Solitude because you're a creature light deck and they have a free exile spell. And the life gain is not super relevant most of the time. Like it can be, but it's not some back-breaking thing. All right, so I've got the ability to drown or counterspell. I'm really just trying to find like another way to lose life to get Shadow of Mortality down with counter backup. But my opponent's going to let me get a nice little hit in with a Shadow here if I just dismember this Ice Fang Coatl. I'm fine going down to 4. Shieldred or Solitude on uh, the Shadows, a little annoying, but what you gonna do? I could fight over the Wren, but they didn't have a fetch land in hand or in the graveyard. If they did have a fetch, I'd probably counter the Wren, but because they didn't, I'm kind of okay letting the Wren resolve. And then if they did play a fetch and went to crack it, I could respond with Shieldred's Edict. But then having something like Shadow of Mortality staring down double prismatic ending right here feels so, so good. Because they're just like, cool, you got it. Um, Firing off the drown there first. Because if my opponent did have endurance, I could always like fight over the endurance or the bring to light with the counter spell. But because they didn't have endurance, I want to go ahead and get the drown out of hand first in case they do find an endurance later. So like there's a risk that drown in the lock will be dead over the next couple turns, but counterspell is going to be live. Here my opponent went to game 3, mulled to oblivion, scooped it up. So that was kind of cool. We take those. So this is on the play again. Like anytime you have one mana interaction, even if it's stubborn denial, on the play, or like consider just something to do on turn 1 into a whole mess of counter spells, it's probably going to be a very reasonable hand. Like you don't want to see a Ragavan, but at least you have the chance to consider into like a fatal push or a what's it called? Fatal push or a drown in the lock to hit a Ragavan on your turn 2. So we thought takes away the Dolthy. I see that my opponent does not have a way of killing the Shadow right here. So I'm going to go ahead and drop it down, be mana efficient. If they do find like a Bolt or a Fury or something here, that's kind of okay because I do just have the Murktide follow up. But if they don't find anything, then I'm going to just try to like tempo out with Shadow. Obviously, I would have loved to have had a third fetch land there, but all hands can't be perfect. Let them grieve because they 2-for-1 take something, and I still get counter spells and stubs and whatnot. Saving the stubborn denial in case like this I hit another fetch land, because then I could hold up both counter spell and stub. Like I think I'm gonna end up playing out playing out the other shadow. Man, tongue twister. But if I didn't play the other shadow, I'd want the ability to be able to double spell right there. Then consider for a fetch land just to try to make this lethal right away. And then playing the Murktide because I don't think there's anything my opponent can play that can block the shadows and deal with the Murktide. So if they did have like a Scam Fury, they'd have to just kill the Murktide. If they had Red Source, yeah, they would have to have Red Land, Undying Effect, Spyro, Fury, and a card to ditch to Spyro to gum up the board there. If they had like a Terminate for the Murktide, red source Spyro, then they wouldn't be able to put an extra blocker into play to block the second shadow. So I'm fine there. If they have a fatal push for a shadow red source Spyro, they wouldn't be able to terminate the Murktide. I'm fine there. So a little bit of risk mitigation, I guess. All right. Sideboarding against Rakdos. Usually I'm just trimming on like some Street Wraiths and Thought Seizes, bringing in some dress downs or however many dress downs I have on the board, unlicensed hearse, the extra fatal push, the Shieldred's Edict, the Turox. I just want like bodies. That's kind of the big thing. Is just having cards that do stuff. All right. They could have a fatal push or a terminate, but I kind of need to be on the board to some extent. Or an EE for one. Little more unfortunate, but it is what it is. I don't really understand playing out an EE on one and then proceeding to terminate the shadow. Like, just pop the EE, especially when you saw like Murktide Regent game one. You really need to save that, save the EE, or save the terminate. I mean, all right. So if they didn't have this Ragavan here, we could fetch up an island and Odawara the Dothy. But them having another threat means that did not work out. All right, Shadow's good. If they play Ragavan, we've got Dismember. I really have to stress like how big of an issue on turn one Ragavan is. So in matchups where you know Ragavan is going to be very crucial, you can very much consider like mulling aggressively for Ragavan or for like an answer to Ragavan. It's less necessary on the play because you get access to like Drown in the Lock on turn two as well. But on the draw, Ragavan's a nightmare. All right, decide to just exile or dress down the grief instead of using up one of my counters so I can like save it to protect the shadow like in this situation. So now I get to kill the grief and stub the EE. Unless they have a fatal push. Kind of rude, OP. So Ragavan gets a push. And this is kind of the situation. I should just play out this Murktide here. I think I was just too concerned that my opponent was going to have like a way to make a creature crew up the hearse and force the chump block. But I think I still should have just played it out. Yeah. We're in pretty rough shape to that hearse. I was going to make some other point right there, but I forgot what it was. All right. Thoughtseize. We're up against, looks like Zoo, Tribal Flames, Goy, Stub. Zoo with Mishra's Bauble. So we do have Dismember to fight over most of their big threats. So I really want to save the Dismember to fight over like a Scion of Draco or a it can kill a Kavu, but mostly like Scion of Draco. Leyline Binding my what's his name? My Murktide. Oh, I was gonna say at the end of that Rakdos game that's where like Shadow of Mortality really shines. Is when you get to that point in the game that like like Murktide is pretty well under control by Grave Hate, and having access to Shadow of Mortality is just like a 2 mana threat that gets through the Grave Hate. All right, stub the bolt, so I don't have to fight over tribal flames if I don't want to. Or I can put myself in a position like this where they're forced to tribal flames, and I just get to dismember this Kavu because they cannot fetch without dying. I say they can't fetch. They can clearly fetch, but it's just not going to work out too well. Oh, hopefully the volume wasn't getting too low there. So against Zoo, treating it like a bunch of the aggressive red decks, like Street Wraith is coming out pretty quickly. Because they are like a 4 bolt, 4 tribal flames. Sometimes you'll see builds with burst lightning and stuff like that. So I'm staring at this double dress down, just like praying that my opponent will put a Kavu on the stack. And they just won't. And it's so annoying. Get down Shadow, see if my opponent wants to hustle with the Shadow. They do not. I could play out the polluted delta, but I really don't want to I don't want to commit to polluted delta yet because I don't know how much life I am okay losing or not. And I think that's something that a lot of shadow players kind of struggle with, is recognizing how much you can or can't afford to lose at any given point. And they'll just kind of say like, "Oh, well, I've got fetch lands, I've got Thought Seizes, Wraiths, like I need to do all of these game actions now." And that ends up getting them killed because they just aren't like conservative with their life loss at all. All right, see if yep. So we didn't have to dress down there, able to just like swing through with the shadow. Just kind of takes a little bit of the uncertainty out. Cuz like if we go for the dress down first and our opponent responds with like leyline binding, then we lose our shadow. We don't have a way to fight over the leyline binding. But since we can present lethal first and then have the dress down up, if our opponent responds with like fetch, cast leyline binding, we can respond with dress down, get the draw, and maybe hit a counter spell to fight over the binding. So just remember that a lot of times less is more. And if you can get the same result taking less game actions, it's probably pretty beneficial. All right, so Scalding Tarn for Jetmir Garden, Arid Mesa makes me think it's almost certainly creativity. Um, so I could fire off Thoughtseize here, but I would rather wait until next turn when I can fire it off with like Counterspell backup. And I could pay for the Spell Pierce. I could Counterspell, but my opponent missed their last land drop. So I'm pretty on board with just like letting them go to their turn. Don't really want to play out the shadow here while I can't protect it. But I absolutely want to counter a Wrenn and 6. And I definitely want to hold these stubs as much as I can. So here's a really big clock. Stubborn Denial backup. So if our opponent does have like a leyline binding, we can fight over that. If they have binding plus a spell pierce, so be it. But it looks like they do not. So we're just going to go to their turn with double counter spell. And I think creativity is like one of the matchups that if you're really concerned about it or really don't like playing against creativity, then Dimir Shadow might be a really good option for you. Sideboarding a lot of the 1-for-1 spot removals coming out, bringing in like EE, Fluster Storms. I'll bring in Unlicensed Hearse if I think my opponent is like heavy on persist effects, usually against like Jund. I don't really like them so much against like the 5-color builds because between Prismatic Ending, Leyline Binding, to Fairy, there's just a bunch of stuff that like doesn't really care about. Um, care about the graveyard. Veil of Summer, blah blah blah. Uh, so if they want to find a way to make like 4-color pile decks a little bit worse, banning Veil of Summer I think is pretty high up on the list of suggestions. Like make Thoughtseize playable. Get a Murktide down, just start adding pressure. This is kind of one of the reasons that I went from 4 Murktide down to 3. Is I just found myself in more and more of these hands that like had multiple Murktide, and I didn't want multiple Murktide. So crack in, play another Shadow, see what happens. We know they're going to have a whole mess of chump blockers going forward, but we do just have like 2 lethal Shadows attacking in. So if we can find like a piece of interaction for a token or something, then we might have a reasonable shot. Yep. We'll just pass the turn, see if our opponent goes to combat. I was kind of hoping they would go to like steal or copy the token and I would get to respond by stealing it, but they went ahead and went to combat with both. So they got a treasure. Either way, the Archmage's Charm wasn't going to stop a Veil of Summer there. So on to game 3. Got Stub for like a Wrenn and 6. Maybe Drowning Lock comes live. Got EE to fight over tokens. I did mention at the start of the video that the league is not necessarily representative of the list that I showed. The list that I showed at the beginning is more of like what I'm playing now. This league and these other ones that I'm going to be uploading are more of the testing process. And the first few leagues I ran in the testing process were running Steam Vents over Hallowed Fountain because I was kind of at that thought of, oh, it doesn't really matter what I run. I just want one more shock land that's blue. Turns out that, like I said, the Hallowed Fountain is the right choice because it can cleave a Path of Peril in the sideboard. So if you see Steam Vents in any of the videos, that has been changed to a Hallowed Fountain in the current builds. It's kind of like free to do. Thoughtseize is a really good pickup to snag a creativity. So I'd rather snag the creativity than the spell pierce because ultimately, like, the pierce isn't doing much. And if I hit one more land, then the pierce might just be completely dead. But if I take creativity, then all they have to do is top deck like another creativity or a Veil of Summer or something like that. And I'm kind of SOL. Murktide's a good pickup. So with Spell Pierce, I can't stop a creativity anyway. So I might as well just like give them the window to top deck one right now. If I had another land, I wouldn't play the Murktide. This is also a really funny situation that they went for creativity for 1. So that means they actually have to double chump block here instead of getting to keep their Archon. Ren is fine. And they just died of Murktide. So they wanted to hold up Spell Pierce to like protect the creativity there. But holding up the Spell Pierce actually ended up getting them killed because we could just play through one Archon. If they had gotten a second Archon, we were dead, but then obviously they wouldn't have been able to hold up Spell Pierce. So I get the argument, but you probably have to just like play the creativity for two and know that you're going to win the game if it resolves, as opposed to playing it for one and leaving it up to chance, especially when you know that Murktide or that Archon's on chump block duty on the way back. Um, so yeah, pretty interesting game there. I think that league ended up like 4-1 or something. But yeah, this is again the list that I'm currently or closer to currently on. Uh, I think at the moment I'm fourth Murktide as a Brazen Borrower, and the first Archmage's Charms, the second Dress Down. A little more elementals running around with the introduction of the One Ring and Orcish Bowmaster into Modern. But other than that, yeah, hope y'all enjoy the video. Let me know what you think. As always, if you're enjoying the commentary or the gameplay, feel free to drop a follow on YouTube. Really trying to get up to that 1,000 subscriber mark. Otherwise, hope y'all have an awesome rest of your day. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.